introduce, actually our title sponsor this afternoon is Corey from US Bank, and he is going to introduce Dino for us. So again, on behalf of the Ben Chamber, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dino, for being here, and Corey, if you want to come on up.
Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for coming out. US Bank's really excited to be partnering with the Chamber for these Enrichment Series courses, and in particular today we're really excited to have Dino here. I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of information on Dino, let him tell you about himself. There's a nice write-up in this, but we're very excited to have Dino, and thank you for coming out and working with us this afternoon, and I'll hand it over.
There we go. Let there be technology. Okay. All right, thanks for coming. As Corey said, I'm Dino Vendetti. I moved here a couple of years ago full-time after spending probably 10 years commuting back and forth to my vacation home here. And then over the last couple of years, decided to turn that into a full-time permanent move. And over the course of the last couple of years, I, in addition to co-founding a local accelerator in town called Founders Pad, I decided to raise an early-stage venture capital fund called Seven Peaks Ventures, which we'll talk about. But the purpose of this talk is to really focus in on what are the key, what are the transformations occurring in the technology world that are leading to a regionalization of opportunity outside of the major metro areas that historically essentially captured all of the capital and talent, especially in the tech industry. To give you a perspective on that, I'm going to focus a little bit initially in the talk on what's happening in the tech industry. Talk a little bit about the capital markets because they play a huge role in this whole opportunity, and then talk about what's going on in Bend and what's going on in other regional markets around the country that I think is really interesting. So to start, there's really over the last century and a half, there's really been two major technology revolutions. The Industrial Revolution, which essentially ushered in the world of automation and factories and transportation and so forth. And then the Internet Revolution over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, that really has led to this huge explosion in computing power, information access, and communication. And so if we look at the rise of the internet, it began back in the 80s when we were sort of living in the PC era, and the innovations that were occurring back then were largely in semiconductor companies, software companies like Microsoft, PC companies. As we got into the 90s, that infrastructure was being laid, and that sort of allowed the data networking revolution to occur, which essentially was connecting all these PCs together. And of course, the internet version 1.0 came about, and now the telecom industry decided, okay, we need to go lay tons of fiber everywhere. And so, all of that kind of led up to this big crescendo and called the dot-com bubble that, of course, blew up. And because there really wasn't enough, there wasn't real business models behind the first generation of internet companies. Then in the 2000s, while that infrastructure got laid, in terms of all the networking capacity, the industry, the startup world, started laying the grounds for like the next wave of technology companies, and they were centered around this notion of the cloud, which is essentially remotely, it's big data, big networks. Amazon's was the first cloud service provider. And what they essentially were doing is renting out time on their servers so that companies, instead of having to buy their own servers and then rent colo space in a telco facility, they could just rent server capacity by the instance, by the in the cloud. And so that added a huge scalability kind of benefit to those companies and dramatically reduced the cost of getting a company started. So then Web 2.0 and the mobile web and social media, essentially created this huge interconnectivity of people and ideas and devices. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, in this current decade, there's been a huge push toward enterprise collaboration, taking some of the power of social networking into the enterprise. And what we're on the edge of right now is a couple of other major technology trends. One that's known as the Internet of Things, which essentially this idea of connecting millions, in fact, ultimately billions of different devices and pieces of equipment to the internet, so that they're networked. And then, of course, the whole data analytics revolution that's occurring, that is in a big way going to impact the medical industry, and that's largely being made available because of the decoding of the human genome over the last decade, and so it's ushering in this whole world of personalized medicine and personalized pharmaceutical products. So one of the things that over the last several decades, a lot of different communities, regions of the world, et cetera, have all tried to replicate Silicon Valley. And the problem is, the playbook for Silicon Valley is unique to Silicon Valley. But what makes it magical? And it's really that it started with this huge density of tech companies that were the foundational companies for a lot of the different industries. And they were important because inside those companies you had a lot of talent and a lot of intellectual horsepower. And that talent eventually spun out and started up startups. And so you had there was an entrepreneurial spirit and willingness to take risk in the valley that was just rewarded. So it wasn't punished, it was rewarded. And then you had the major universities that were constantly generating new talent, and you had infinite amounts of capital to invest in those companies. And then what happens then is the talent and the capital and the wealth created by that recycles. So as a startup has a liquidity event, now those founders and the key people in that company, they go on and found their next company. And the wealth that gets created by the investors and by the management teams get reinvested in the next wave of the next batch of startups. And so pretty soon you have this incredible mosh pit of energy that's occurring. And then that's kind of led to this notion of the last 20 years, as the level of integration at the hardware level has increased, just dramatically. What it's really done is that it's allowed software to be the core technology element. And so we live now in a software-defined world. Everything is software. Yes, there's hardware. Yes, we have iPhones, but essentially, you take any semiconductor company today, and 60 to 70% of their engineers are software developers. And 20 years ago, it would have been 5%. So between this increased digitization of everything, of content, of everything, and the pervasive networking and connectivity that we live in, low-cost bandwidth, low-cost data storage, and open source development tools that make writing applications much easier than it was 10 years ago. That's essentially allowed every industry, product, and technology to be transformed by software. And when we sort of map that against this thing called the Internet of Things, that slide didn't show up. Okay, the background colors aren't showing. But essentially, Moore's law really was coined to sort of describe the evolution of the semiconductor, the doubling of capacity of semiconductor chips every 2 years. Metcalfe's law describes sort of this notion that the power, the value of a network, of X number, of any number of users, the value of that network goes up as the square of the number of people in the network. And then data analytics, as we move into this world where we're living in massive quantities of data, the ability to analyze and make sense out of that data becomes really important. And so, I could have built a slide that showed the time it took to get to the first million users or 10 million users in each of these waves of technology, and what it would look like would be everything just keeps happening faster and faster. So, and that's an example of just the fact that all these people and all these devices and all from a communication standpoint, we're all networked together. The rise of the cloud. So the number of just 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, there was essentially, Amazon was just launching the cloud, their cloud service. And since then, there's, billions and billions of applications that are run on the cloud and objects stored in the cloud. And now Google has their own version of it, and Microsoft does, and IBM does. And it's important because it fundamentally took the cost for a startup from, and a startup back in 2000 would have probably had to spend $1 million or $2 million just on buying servers, renting colo space, and now that's zero. Now the only capital that a software startup has to invest in is really the laptops that the developers are writing code on, and so that was pretty dramatic. So this massive quantity of digital information that's out there, and that's growing at a huge rate. There's 2.5 billion gigabytes of new data created every day. Wow. And by some measures, 34% of that information is deemed useful, 7% of it is actually tagged, and 1% is actually analyzed. So we're swimming in data. And the challenge is, how do you make sense out of it? And of course, that leads to hiring challenges, because where do you find the people that are going to actually do this work? And this was a survey that was done by Silicon Valley Bank, and you can't read a lot of it, but basically the gist is 91% of the companies found hiring to be very challenging. And over half of those companies responded that they will hire mostly experienced STEM workers, which is probably makes sense, but unfortunately we're not producing enough of them. And so there's a huge gap actually in the number of STEM workers that are actually entering the workforce. There's a huge number that are going through our universities, but most of them are being sent back to the countries they came from because there's a cap on H-1B visas. There's only 85,000 H-1B visas allowed a year, and there's a $380,000 gap, or 380,000 that are being sent back. To make matters worse, about 1.5% of the 25 to 35-year-olds in the workforce have a college degree in a science-related field. That puts us down at the bottom third of developed countries. By 2020, it's estimated we'll have a 1.5 million person gap in the workforce. And about only a quarter of our K through 12 kids are performing on par with some of the better nations around the world in terms of their young kids. So now, if you map that, and I don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer here, but if you map that against global GDP trends, the U.S. there in the blue line is, as you can see, we're kind of rolling over, and China and India are coming up. So the demand on the global workforce is just going to continue to be extreme, especially for knowledge workers. And that demand is not just kind of national. It's not just in the major metro areas. It's actually across all of the country. And so the Northwest is this kind of purple group right here. So we're a little behind New England and a bit behind California and New York. But still, there's pretty there's a lot of demand for these kind of workers in our region as well. So this regionalization, this notion of regionalization, where the Industrial Revolution essentially sucked everybody into the big cities. From the rural America into the big cities, because that's where factories were. That's where everything was congregating. And really, the first wave of technology, of the technology revolution, did the same thing. And it was mostly, in Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, etc. However, there's something changing there, and what's changing is that there's this regional expansion of tech, and it's occurring because of this software-defined world we live in, which essentially allows professionals to have their careers are more portable today than they ever were. Ubiquitous bandwidth allows them to essentially work anywhere. You could be working on a beach in the Caribbean, and nobody would really know if you were a software developer. And then the hiring challenges that every company is facing, the ones in Silicon Valley are facing it every bit as much as the companies in Portland or Seattle or Bend. There's just a bigger pool of people there that are competing for a bigger group of companies competing for the same pool of people. So those factors have caused companies that historically were more centralized to be willing to expand regionally. And then there was another sort of regionalization wave that's occurring, which is in the form of entrepreneurship. And that's being driven because of the cloud, open source software development tools, because of the bandwidth, and as well because of new sources of capital, from angel investors, from regional funds that are reacting to this opportunity. And then I would say the other thing that's driving this is that there's over the last decade, I think, maybe in part because of the two pretty severe recessions, I think people have decided, you know what, gosh, this whole idea of like working for a company for life and a pension, that's gone. So people look at their careers, as a series of projects more often than not, and so I think what that's done is that it's caused people to prioritize where they live, and I think it's one of the things that's been going at play here in Bend. But this wave of entrepreneurship is hatching a whole new group of companies and startups. If you look at Portland and the startups that are there, if you compared that to 15 years ago, virtually all of those entrepreneurs would have been folks that spun out of Intel or Tektronix or Mentor Graphics, and their startups were semiconductor-based or hardware-based. Today, it's a whole new generation of young entrepreneurs. Probably a lot of them don't even know who Tektronix was. and they're building software companies and companies that are very, very different than the prior era, and very much more capital efficient. And so if this regionalization wave is occurring, then how does that sort of relate to the job creation front and what's important to regional communities? So again, I apologize, the fonts here are kind of small, but this is the Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City did a study last year that they published that measured a couple of things. One was the net job creation that occurs and they correlated that against the age of the company. So, and the different, there's different types of high tech, and then this is the total private sector, the black. So what you can see is that virtually all net new job growth and creation occurs from companies that are less than 5 years old.
Thanks, Dino.
That makes it a little harder.
Not too bad.
How's your memory?
You got a computer.
Got it right here. Yeah.
Wow,
That's all a test, Dino.
that's a bummer.
So, is this new economy based on electricity?
We need some.
Yeah.
So anyway, but that statistic actually makes sense when you think about it, because mature companies, by default, they're mature, so their primary objective is to squeeze the margin out of their business and to optimize, for cost, and so on average they shed jobs. They don't create jobs, and whereas the smaller companies are the ones that are actually growing and hiring and creating jobs. What I could do.
Oh, you have power there.
I do. I have battery.
Yeah.
The whole building lost power, so.
The whole building did?
Yeah, wow. So this is the generator. That light, the emergency light, yeah. Yeah.
So we're toast.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole rest of the.
Bummer.
You're good. Keep going.
Just talking outside.
Turn your app.
There we go. Okay, so yeah, let me. This is really going to suck, but. So this slide is the Kauffman Foundation did it. They actually measured the startup density around the country, and
Want me to hold that for you?
essentially, basically, they measured it across all the metro areas around the nation. And what was interesting was that Silicon Valley and San Francisco were not number one. Boulder, Colorado was number one. And Bend, Oregon was number 16. And so what I found interesting as I kind of dug into that data a little bit was that Bend was the only metro area in the country in the top 25 without a four-year university. Now we've got OSU Cascades going in, but that really had nothing to do with this data, because it's yet to really produce a lot of graduates.
Where did
So,
that data come from?
the Kauffman Foundation.
Thank you.
So you can't read this, but essentially the big idea that I think is what we're playing for here is that the majority of the spoils, the majority of the value of the wealth that's going to be created from all of this is going to go to those sectors, regions, and nations that can figure out how to keep the innovation funnel packed with young, talented entrepreneurs and startups, and then provide them with the people and capital that they need to grow. That's and you see that being played out. This this slide here basically just shows you kind of the peak in terms of venture funding back in 2000, and then and how it's kind of, it dropped after the bubble, the dot-com bubble, and then it's now climbing back. But the interesting part of this is that more startup, the average amount of capital that a startup requires today is dramatically lower than what it was back in the dot-com era. So there's more startups being funded on less capital today, and that's a good thing. This is really just, it shows the venture capital returns, which is the blue line, correlated to the S&P 500. And so, venture capital returns after, in the kind of the early 2000s, they suffered, because of the dot-com bubble bursting. But then, over the last half a decade, they've come, storming back, and now they're significantly outperforming the S&P 500. The other interesting thing that's going on is that, and I wish you could actually see this slide, but essentially there's way more wealth that's being created in private markets today than in public markets. So if you look at the IPOs of Microsoft, Amazon, Cisco, back in the 80s and 90s, those IPOs, the IPO values, the market caps when they went public, for Microsoft was 800 million, for Amazon was 400 million, and for Cisco was 200 million. And then their values today, are 370 billion, 166 billion, and 133 billion. So all of that upside accrued to public investors. Okay? Now look at the IPOs of Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Facebook went public at a market cap of 104 billion. Okay? Its current valuation is 177 billion. Twitter went public at a market cap of 18 billion. Current market cap 22 billion. And LinkedIn went out at a market cap of 4.3 billion, and its current market cap is 20 billion. Now, granted, they're newer companies, so they haven't had as long to rise in value, but still, the substantially more wealth accrued to public market investors with Microsoft, Amazon, and Cisco, and the majority, the lion's share of the wealth accrued to private investors in Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And the reason for that is in part because of Sarbanes-Oxley and the reaction, kind of post the dot-com bubble meltdown, which just made it very, very challenging for companies to go public, and in fact, in many ways, de-incentivized them to want to go public. So they just stayed private longer. Of course, what do the capital markets do? They react, and private equity investors come in and fill that gap. And so the wealth is being aggregated to that group. So if we think about building a thriving, startup community, part of the foundational element is are we living in a entrepreneurial community? And I think because you got to have that, you got to have a willingness for entrepreneurs to take risk. They need to be rewarded for risk taking. They can't be punished for risk taking. And then you need talent, mentorship, and capital to fuel their growth. And you need an environment where you're experimenting as a startup community to figure out what works in your community. And so those experiments have been going on. The other thing you need to do is identify and understand what are your tech clusters. So in Bend, we've got a number of tech clusters. There's the software/hardware tech cluster. There's a biosciences tech cluster. There's an outdoor products tech cluster. There's an aviation and craft beverage, brewery tech cluster. So I think in Bend we've actually got some fairly identifiable, tech clusters that are driving the startup community here. So the challenge then, the core challenge for all of these companies is how do you scale, and how do you how do you scale operations? How do you obtain the equity financing to scale and the talent? And there's been a bunch of test cases on this in other cities around the country. So what are those cities doing? So they are, number one, I think, is you to recognize that you're competing with other regions for talent capital. Other cities within your region, other regions in general, just like the US is competing with other countries. And so some of these communities are offering pretty big tax incentives. There's public funding for accelerators and co-working space. There's investment in the local seed funds. And essentially, what you're trying to do is maximize the incentives for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial talent to choose your community. So one example is what's happening in New York. So Governor Cuomo launched this program called Startup New York. And essentially it allows businesses to operate tax-free for 10 years. Further, it allows the employees of those businesses to not pay income tax for 5 years. And so there's no business tax, there's no corporate tax, there's no local and sales and property taxes for those businesses, no franchise fees. I mean, that's competition. So what he's trying to do is remove as many barriers as possible to get companies to choose New York. And you can just go to startup.ny.gov and read it for yourself. It's kind of amazing, but that's what's happening. The Northwest is lagging behind other regions in terms of across in a number of categories, in terms both the number of startups that are being created as well as the amount of capital that's being invested in those startups. And then Oregon is really lagging Washington. So this slide here, the orange is Washington and the blue is Oregon. But on a per capita basis, there's just substantially more capital being invested in private tech companies in the state of Washington than the state of Oregon. And so it's it's something that, and it's not a surprise to probably to a lot of the folks in this room. It's been analyzed to death. The state of Oregon realizes that. Ted Wheeler commissioned a study that essentially called the Oregon Capital Scam that showed exactly this result. So, and what I found a little depressing was, that Oregon was, in terms of the states, ranked number 20 in the nation in terms of venture capital dollars invested. And that's down from number, that was in 2013, and that was down from number 18 of the nation in 2012. So, and those numbers kind of ebb and flow a bit, So I could see it. I could see the state of Oregon bouncing back up to kind of 18-ish, But but at the same time, the state of Oregon, if you look at the startups in the state of Oregon, there's a lot of really successful companies being built here, in spite of the fact that there's, we're so pathetic in terms of the amount of capital that's being invested in, that's organic capital from the state of Oregon. Now, the reason for that is, of course, that these companies are being funded by investors from Silicon Valley and from Seattle. And so, and that brings in another issue, but which I'll get to in a minute. But so, in terms of filling that capital gap, what I've been doing is I've over the last 2 years raised an early stage venture fund called Seven Peaks Ventures. It's a $7 million fund based here in Bend, but will invest across the state. And the unique thing about it is that there's a deep bench of really talented industry experts that are part of the fund that located here as well as down in Silicon Valley. And so far to date, we've made investments in 7 companies throughout the state. And so one of our strategies is really to try to help the founders of these companies, play on a more equal footing with their Silicon Valley competitors. And so there's a couple of ways that we try to do that. One is by having a group of venture partners, part of the fund, that are down in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, that are experts in their own areas of the industry. And they help the companies that we invest in Oregon with networking and partnering and all the things that hopefully will lead to faster growth of their business. And then we also try to help them with hiring and raising their next rounds of funding and with on the capital side as well. In terms of Bend, there's the resources in Bend. There's a number of different sort of groups that are forming that are resources that are at play here. In addition to Founders Pad, of course, the BBC is probably the main event, each year, for startups, and every year it seems to get better and better. EDCO, which manages and runs the BBC as well as all the pub talks, has been a real staple of pushing this ecosystem forward. There's a new accelerator focused on outdoor products called Outdoor Works, and Gary's running that. There's a group that's forming to create a accelerator that's focused on the biosciences area, and Les and Kate and Craig are there's several people here that are focused on that. There's a group, a couple of other groups in town. One that's focused on sort of trying to help different local efforts in terms of connecting them, and that's called Looking Forward. Jim and Linda and I don't know if Rita, they're all in that group, and I've been helping them a bit. So anyway, there's an ecosystem here that's forming. Where is Ben today? What's the report card? To me, it's, I think Bend has a lot of attributes going for it. There's a really high quality of life. There's some pretty high caliber talent, although it's skewed a bit toward, the older end of the spectrum, because I think over the years there's been a lot of really talented people that have kind of moved here when their careers would really allow them to, as opposed to in the earlier parts of their careers. I think Bend has a very entrepreneurial culture, which is really important. I think it's been entrepreneurial over the decades out of necessity, because as people moved here, they had to start a business to have a job. And I think there's the different startup clusters are forming. There's kind of leaders emerging out of those clusters, and I think that's all really, really good. But the infrastructure here is still really early, and I think it still has a lot of work to go. So, and there's big talent gaps in a bunch of different key areas. OSU Cascades needs to ramp way faster. I'm incredibly impatient with sort of with that. I mean, we need to be graduating computer science majors like yesterday. We need to launch a data science program there that's going to crank out data scientists. There's a lot of stuff we should be doing, and but it's a university, so it moves at its pace, right? I think that the Bend, community needs to rally around and support these startup clusters in a big time way, because, again, just look at what's going on in New York. Go Google what's happening in Columbus and Cincinnati. If you just spend 15 minutes on the internet, what you'll find is there's other startup communities around the country that are putting their money where their mouth is. And they're putting their weight of the business community in the cities behind this, because they recognize that this is their future. And so I think that the spoils of all this are going to go to those communities that can attract the innovation talent, and then remove as much friction out of the way of the startups that are being built in those regions. And because we are, like it or not, we're competing with Boulder, we're competing with Portland, we're competing with Eugene, we're competing with Salt Lake City, we're competing with Silicon Valley, we're competing with China, we're competing with everybody. So and what we need to do is then leverage the assets that Bend has to maximal advantage, as we compete for that talent and capital. Because at the end of the day, what ends up happening is if we can get our own recycling engine kickstarted, where as these companies grow, have success, have a liquidity event, get acquired, then the key people in those companies are going to spin out and start their next startup. And then the wealth that gets created by not just the team, but also by the investors who back those companies, is now going to be hopefully recycling as well, and being reinvested in the next wave of companies and the next wave of companies. And it doesn't take very long for that before all of a sudden you've really got a vibrant, ecosystem. And I think that's really what the opportunity is, here in Bend. And I think the next decade is going to be pretty exciting. And we'll look back and without a doubt, we'll be able to point to a number of success stories, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that have propelled Bend on more and more on the map at the national level. So that was that's all the slides I had. Thank God. So I would be step back up here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or.
Could you talk about your tech space or your defense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when you say where's Bend, I was thinking you might talk about that.
Yeah, it was actually one of the logos on that slide. But yeah, so there's a tech space that we're creating over on MK, and it's a 26,000 square foot building that is going to house not only the Bend Tech co-working space group, which is run by Tech Alliance, but also several different startups and as well as Founders Pad and hopefully the other accelerators that sort of gain critical mass. There's also going to be a cafe in there with also that will serve beer and wine for events, and so it'll be the idea is to create a real core place that the startup community can congregate. And that was something most of the startup communities that I've visited over the last 5 years, when they really started taking off is when there was enough critical mass to support that kind of a building, that kind of a location for the entrepreneurs to do their thing. And so that will open up in October. It's currently gutted and about to get redone. Yeah.
Can you talk about the UAV industry and how much of an impact you think that's going to have on the Bend economy?
Yeah, I think the UAV industry is really interesting. And I think the initial wave of applications that seem to be gaining the most traction are for agriculture. And, again, it's kind of one of those big data analytics kind of opportunities. And I think it's still pretty early, but there's a number of startups that are that are formed, that are under being built throughout the state. There's a couple in Portland. There's some here. There's a guy in town, Mark Morrison, who's essentially working on trying to drive that whole initiative and trying to make Central Oregon an even more prominent place for the UAV industry to take hold. The Eastern Oregon ended up getting a lot of the testing grants for the UAV space from the FAA. So hopefully it'll blossom. Yeah, Gary.
Back to the, I believe it was the Kaufman report, where Bend was 16th and Boulder was 1. You said we were the only one in the top 25 without a 4-year university. Where else, as far as like population, are most of the cities ahead of us also bigger?
Most of them are.
Corvallis, I think.
But there was a couple that were about the same
was
size or smaller. Yeah. Fort Collins. I'm not sure how big Cheyenne is, but I would say that we're not the tiniest by any measure.
So that begs a follow-up. Sorry to interrupt.
We're definitely between Cheyenne and
You want questions from our table? I got a whole bunch of something. I think you sort of alluded to the fact that OSU Cascades may not be fast enough.
Yep.
So what do we do? How do we get another institution here that can turn out STEM talent more quickly to meet that 5-year goal you talked about?
Good question. I mean, that one's above my pay grade. But honestly, I think the other thing we can do is some of the things that we're starting to experiment with at Founders Pad, which is to run very targeted workshops. And if those succeed, then maybe those turn into maybe like a mini certificate program, And so one of the areas that I'm just like all over is data science. And I really want to see some sort of a program get built here that cranks out or trains up data scientists. And it doesn't, because the raw ingredients you need are, you're not going to take some kid out of high school and turn him into a data scientist in that kind of a program. Usually the entry level kind of requirements are going to be somebody who's already got some sort of a technical degree. And then with probably 6 months to 9 months of very focused coursework, you could build some real core competency and skill sets in that kind of person. So data science is one area. There's a number of areas that are just I constantly see as gaps in startups. UX designers is another one. Certain sophisticated fields within marketing is another area. And so, I think that, very focused, targeted programs could potentially fill those gaps, at least until, the university can catch up.
Well, and Dino, you're a big fan of recruitment of talent as well. So recruitment of talent within the time span that OSU Cascades can get on par. We're seeing a lot of that now, where people are sick of driving an hour and a half each way in Silicon Valley, and they're interested in going mountain biking and going to the mountain, and so I think you're a proponent for that as well.
Yeah, big time. But right now, we have to organically produce our own as well, because you will never be able to recruit enough in. Mm-hmm. So, and until really OSU Cascades launched, 100% of our four-year university-bound high school grads left Central Oregon. You know, some of them went to COCC, you know, but the ones that went to a four-year university right out of high school, 100% of them left. Most of them never to return until maybe way later in their careers. So that's unacceptable. We're not going to, you know, solve this talent crisis if that's occurring.
So what do you think a scenario for land use and housing looks like? You know, so I'm thinking the young creative crowd, getting the density and the cluster and the excitement going. Does that mean high density apartments? Does that mean rural living inside or outside the city? Large lot, small lot? Any thoughts on that?
I'm a tech guy, Tony. I'm not this guy. I think
so. Somebody that's walking from an apartment in downtown San Francisco, getting on some trolley to get to some apartment. Or
I think
whatever.
what
What
they
does it
want.
look like here?
They want walkability.
Yeah.
They you know. So I think that kind of and if you look at now the triangle that's kind of drawn on the map by downtown Bend, where OSU Cascades is going in, and the old mill. That triangle to me kind of just screams out that's where those people want to live.
So opposed to living 5 miles out of town on a couple acres. That's kind of what I was asking.
They don't want to live there.
Yeah.
If they had their choice,
In town.
Yeah.
Dino, why don't you give the example of Tony in Vegas, what he's creating?
Oh, right. So back in May, I went to a conference in Vegas that was put on by Tony Say, who's the CEO of Zappos. And what he did was 5 years ago he moved to Vegas, and then 3.5 years ago he moved Zappos in its entirety from the Bay Area to Vegas. And he moved it into north downtown Las Vegas, which was essentially boarded up and dilapidated. You know, it was horrible. It wasn't not the Strip, but like way downtown. And he has been investing. So he's invested so far $250 million of his own money, and he's bought up huge tracts of land down there. He's built, you know, a couple of co-working sort of spaces. There's an accelerator there. He's launched an early stage venture fund, and I've been talking to him about essentially developing a pool of capital that would span across these various regional networks, regional tech startup communities, where we wouldn't have to rely on Silicon Valley VCs to come do our follow-on rounds of funding. And you know, that's a conversation that's kind of in its early stages, but I'm going to try to make that happen, because I think the more capital that we can have available to our companies, the more successful they become.
So he was building housing for them as well, you know? Is he building a campus that includes housing, or just a?
He owns literally 100 apartments there's a brand new kind of high-rise apartment complex. He lives on the penthouse. He bought 100 apartments in there.
Okay.
And so literally, if you want to go to Vegas, you know, you go there and you stay for free in one of his apartments. And the quid pro quo is you got to go spend some mentoring time with some of the startups in the accelerator. So he's, you know, again, he's trying to come up with some creative ways of bringing talent into that area. And yeah, another question.
That's fairly creative.
So I think the one big thing that we need, before I get to my question, is just rental housing, right?
Oh yeah, no, I mean that's
come
obvious.
in because there's no place to rent.
I just wonder about this scenario.
But question, you mentioned that there's a variety of these tech clusters, and I'm curious if you would think that there being such a wide breadth of tech clusters, that is a threat to innovation, and should we focus on a few, both in terms of funding and development of talent?
I think you just let the entrepreneurs run, and you just try to get out of their way. And so if there happens to be like concentrations of entrepreneurs in 5 different industry clusters in Bend, great. Yeah. And just you know, from a friction standpoint, just get the hell out of their way. Let the entrepreneurs take off, right? Because they will build businesses.
Yeah.
They're crazy, right? By design, they're crazy. So they're going to build businesses, and you know, our job is basically, as the community, is, you know, be cognizant of what the things are that we can do to kind of remove friction, and then proactively go try to, you know, fill the capital gap, fill the mentoring gap, you know, surround them with you know, knowledgeable, talented mentors that can help them. They're going to help them avoid making, you know, the mistakes that are avoidable, you know, based on experience.
Dino,
Yeah.
Dino, I wanted to add to that just for a second.
Yep.
In looking forward, we looked at cities that were successful, like Boulder and Austin, and we also looked at cities that weren't successful with it. And to me, it was fascinating to see the difference between the two. The cities that really failed were cities that were really trying to control everything, where the government was funding it, they were coming in and they were saying, we want this sector, and so therefore we're going to invest in that sector. Totally failed.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to make sure we don't do.
Yeah. Tony.
You know, if you had a, you know, one magic bullet, one program, one initiative, one thing you could do here, what would you do? What would be your one thing that you would do in Bend to drive the ecosystem?
I'd raise Seven Peaks Ventures 2, you know, a $50 million fund.
So it's you think
It's capital.
capital?
Yeah, entrepreneur.
What
Every
about
entrepreneur,
incentives?
every entrepreneur I talk to, that I'm talking to about maybe moving here, locating their company here, you know, it always comes down to funding, and so but we got to walk before we run, and you know, at least with Seven Peaks Ventures #1, I mean, the 7 companies we've invested in so far, you know, they're doing a combined revenue of almost $70 million, and we're going to have, you know, close to 20 companies in that portfolio by the time it's done. So I think that fund is really off to the races, and I think that will allow us to then go raise a much bigger fund for Fund 2. And of those companies that we've invested in so far, you know, half of them are, you know, out of Central Oregon. So.
Would incentives be a close second? Would you do something around a tax-free zone or something?
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, I just don't have any confidence that bureaucrats can pull that off. But I mean, you know, at the state level especially, it's just like there's so much just contention around things like that. I mean, it would just be. I mean, I've had that conversation with some of our state representatives, and I had that conversation with Ted Wheeler, and I don't know. I mean, should they do it? Hell yeah. Will they? I don't know. But you know, I'm actually going to send the link to Startup New York to Ted, and just say, you know, this is what the competition is doing, okay? Because we got to get out of our myopic sort of view of the world of, you know, everything is just, you know, our own internal sort of, you know, struggles. That's nothing more than a localized version of what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Right.
You know, where, you know, you sit down and you talk to, you know, our congressmen and our U.S. senators, and, you know, and I have, and it's like they're probably the group of people that are the most devoid of reality of anybody you can possibly talk to. They're just so mired in all their own bullshit that, you know, you walk out of those meetings and you're like, oh my God, well, no wonder it's all screwed up. And so, you know, I think that at a state level and at the local level, you know, you run the risk of that same kind of thing. So I think that the thing that we can and should be doing is we got to find ways to cause people to pop their head up out of the trees and think strategically. And Gary, you had something?
I was just going to add on to what Linda said. You know, I think that's one of the reasons Boulder's been so successful is they have 5 or 6 different clusters that are all healthy and very diverse.
Yeah, so like the outdoor cluster, right, that you're building, that's, you know, very highly leverages the assets that we have here in Bend. You know, which is why I think it's a natural, and it can and should and will be successful. And you know, and we have to just, you know, do whatever we can to sort of make that happen. But again, you know, entrepreneurs will just figure out a way. So they're adaptive, very, very adaptive creatures. So yes, you had a question.
In the UAV and outdoor products industries, I think we might fall into a trap of thinking it must be young college graduates that are going to drive this. But veterans actually play a large role in driving those sectors forward, especially UAV. So to the extent that we could get veterans here, in the same way that we want to attract talent, it might be another way to jumpstart that. And it also keeps us from falling into the trap of one group or one magic bullet is going to lead us forward. Everybody wants to live in walkable apartment housing. That's just not true. Some of them have families. You know, we need to have everybody participating in the tech startup, everybody participating in Bend, and seeing it more open.
And actually, interestingly enough, the average age of startup entrepreneurs in Bend is quite a bit higher than in San Francisco. Quite a bit higher. And I think it just speaks to the demographic, right? I mean, there's a lot of really talented people here that kind of moved here.
Oh.
Hey! Let there be light.
We did that though when we were the telco companies out building fiber everywhere. We couldn't find enough talent, and the talent we could find didn't want to work for the wages that we had in our knock. And so we just started recruiting out of Army, Navy, Air Force.
Well, one of the avenues that I've been working on, I don't know if I'm alone, so asking if there's other people doing this, is my thought is not just trying to get entrepreneurs here to start their businesses, but trying to attract those younger people who can work remotely, still working in the major markets, to get them to at least relocate here, and then as time goes on, they maybe build up some money, they turn their attentions towards starting businesses. Are there any formal programs that are reaching out to those types?
Sort of. Basically, the co-working space, the tech space in Bend, it's probably half those kind of people. And there's a lot of you know, telecommuters that are living here in Bend and working for the mothership down in Silicon Valley or whatever. Or Seattle, yeah. So I think that's just happening very naturally, because you know, a lot of those folks will just, you know, they'll decide, okay, we're packing up and we're moving to Bend, and I've worked out a deal with the boss where I can still kind of, you know, commute up a couple days a week, and then their strategy is, well, I'll do that for a year or two or until I burn out, and meanwhile I'll figure out what I'm going to do next locally. And I think that's been the on-ramp for a lot of people here. Yeah. Les?
You know, what are the major reasons for the lower capital required for startups? I know there's a cloud, there's the internet, there's bandwidth, all that, but is that across the board? Is it just primarily for software industries, or what would you say? Is it culture?
It's most dramatic with software, because essentially your product is code, and that code, that it's destined to sort of live on the cloud, on the servers up there, and so you just don't have to invest in really any capital or infrastructure. For hardware companies, not so much. You know, you still got to build some hardware. You know, different kinds of, you know, like a medical device company, you know, there's cost and capital involved with those, so it's not quite as, which is why there's been, you know, such, you know, which is why software-related businesses have just thrived, right? But I think that capital efficiency is making its way into even traditionally capital-intensive markets, and you know. There's actually, we're about to see a pretty interesting sort of wave of next-gen hardware companies that are integrated hardware-software products. And the hardware is fairly commoditized, or you know, you can customize it, but it's all done in Asia, right? So at fairly low cost.
A lot of virtual companies.
Yeah. So you're not out there, you know, spending a bunch of money, you know, designing that hardware product from the ground up. You're buying different pieces and parts and modules, and then essentially it's being assembled. So
They're building airplanes that way, so.
yeah, yeah. So it's the capital efficiency way. It is helping almost all the sectors, but probably software is just benefits because it's a pure play. Okay.
So, you know, I want to touch on the follow right up your past question on the type of entrepreneur, and going back to, so I'm with Les and leading the bioscience cluster. Kind of going back to your title of startups, growth, and sustainability of your talk, is that even though we have these clusters forming, whether it's Gary with the outdoor, or the bioscience with the tech, or the UAV, and we'll just see where they grow, where they don't grow, but the cluster doesn't essentially equate to being all startups. And bioscience might be an example where we are right now of it's a very veteran group and trying to find out who's involved, who's who, and part of that is just growing in the industry. It may not be at this point starting up, but we certainly want to ensure there's an environment for startups. And there are some great startups that, you know, Seven Peaks are certainly in bioscience supporters of. But I just want to ensure that we don't equate clusters as being only startups. It's growing and make awareness of these industries beyond just the Ben Research and the Gears in town, which are fantastic. But people want to break off from there or come there and want to have other locations or places to grow.
I think Ben Research is a great example because over the years, there's just been a number of people that have spun out of there and started other startups. And you need the Ben Researches of the world, to be the spawning ground of entrepreneurial activity. Because that's what was happening down in Silicon Valley. There, over the decades, it was, whether it was Intel or Cisco or, now it's Google. So how many ex-Googlers do you hear about they're doing their next startup? Tons of them. So.
The other thing I'd add to Kate's comment is that, yes, we have 4 or 5 clusters, but there's so much multidisciplinary crossover between the biosciences, particularly. We rely on tech, certainly software, innovation. We're not just.
That's right. The lines are blurring.
They really are.
Yeah.
And so I like the idea of your tech space in that there's basically no physical walls that's going to inhibit people from having an interchange of ideas sometimes maybe on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
When you're traveling around the country and looking at other communities that are being successful, how would you describe their perception of Central Oregon and Bend as a community that's looking to go down that path? And the second half of the question, as you start to look at second, third, fourth round funding events, what does the investment community think of Central Oregon Bend and its potential to nurture startup companies?
Actually, great questions. So I'd say that the perception of Bend is probably, if the person is familiar with it at all, it's that it's because they made a stop over here on a vacation and they were like, wow, that's a really beautiful, cool place, and so Bend tends to kind of have an impact on people when they visit. So when I was still kind of doing like a regular commute down to the Bay Area, it was amazing how many people I would talk to that had been here. Just amazing. Now, second part of your question, which is what does the venture capital investor community think? They got their heads up their asses because whoops, did I say that? And it's because there's this mindset down in Silicon Valley with the big venture funds that's like, no, we don't want to have to get on an airplane and go fly somewhere else to invest in a company, and so you see that in spades. The slide that I had that you couldn't see with all the logos of all the different startups in Oregon. When if you could have read that thing, what I listed there was all the different venture funds that funded those companies. And there were some big time venture funds that funded those companies, and a lot of them. But when you look at when they invested, it was only after they were doing 5 or 10 million in revenue.
Right.
So when, you know, and at that point it was like, well, of course they're going to go invest then. You know, it's a no-brainer. But when they were earlier, they wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. So I think that it remains an issue. There's some larger venture funds up in Seattle, like Madrona and Ignition, that are very willing to invest in Oregon. And that's why, you know, I'm trying to figure out other ways of attracting capital here from investors who will invest. But yeah, the big VC firms will look at a company in Bend, and their initial conclusion is going to be, how are you going to scale it there?
Right. If it was serious, it would be somewhere else.
Right. So then what they'll do is they'll put a lot of pressure on that team to move headquarters somewhere else.
Right.
And that's what was happening in Portland over the years, not so much today. So today that pressure is kind of diminishing, because I think the venture community looks at Portland and they're like, okay, you can build a company here. And so they're not quite as, you know, quick to kind of conclude that they got to move headquarters down to the Bay Area. But it's always going to be an issue. And so the way that you, the reason that it's actually possible, this whole capital efficiency wave, you know, the reason that you weren't seeing a lot of tech startups in places like Bend 15 years ago was because that was back in the era where startups were pretty capital intensive. So you needed to raise $10 to $15 million to get that company to the point of good product market fit with customers, in revenue, et cetera. And that was really hard to do, unless you were like a stellar entrepreneur with a track record that just attracted capital. You know, today, because you can get that same company probably to the same point of traction on less than $1 million of capital, you know, that amount of capital is you can find that locally. And so what we need to do is just, you know, it's kind of this as we walk up the ladder, you know, it's, you know, continue to kind of, you know, attract and build pools of capital here, but also, you know, really try to roll up our sleeves and help the companies, the startups that are here, you know, achieve success, because that's what's going to attract investors, and it's kind of that virtuous circle. Right.
We have about time for maybe one more question, if anyone wants to ask, and then we're going to have to try and wrap it up.
You worked for a while on trying to get companies to move here. You had this it was like a competition or something. How did that turn out, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, so we held this competition we called the Big Bend Theory, and the idea was to see, you know, what was the caliber of startups and entrepreneurs that were even willing to show up and check it out, right? And so we ended up we were going to just like keep it to 3 companies that we selected, and we ended up with 5. And none of them ended up moving here. So, yeah, but
how many applicants do you have? That's significant.
Oh, there was like about 30. And so, but none of them moved here. 2 of the companies, I would say, had an interest. Maybe 3 of the companies, 3 of the 5 had an interest in potentially opening up an office here. That still may happen, you know, with one of them. But and then one of them ended up being a company that I ended up investing in. So that was actually, you know, like a really good outcome, because it's probably our best investment so far. So but what we learned was once you get more than the founder team, you know, inside the company, and let's say that company's down in San Francisco and they're contemplating moving here, that's a lot of inertia to try to disrupt and bring up. So they will do it if there's funding that goes along with it. And so we could have caused one of these companies for sure to move up here if we were willing to basically fund them, but that we weren't going to fund them at the level that they would have needed to sort of, so that wasn't really a quid pro quo that made any sense. You want to invest in companies based on just your belief of what kind of business they can build, not because you just want to move them up here. But without a doubt, now I will say that, so the Vegas Tech Fund, so the one that Tony Say raised, they will do that. So they will, if you move to Vegas, they'll give you money. So it's, but they're dealing with a much larger pool of capital, and so the amount that they're giving is still really small, so it's like, it kind of makes sense for them. Whereas, for my fund, it's a small fund, $7 million fund, so you can't really do that. But maybe down the road.